My dad was dying. I begged for emergency leave. My manager said, "Not my problem. Cover your shift or you're fired." I took the week off. When I came back, the FBI and the CEO were waiting. My name is Elise Gardner, and the moment my manager Croft Brennan told me my dying father wasn't his problem changed everything about who I thought I was. I stood in that sterile break room still, wearing my stained uniform from the diner where I'd spent 3 years serving coffee to people who barely acknowledged my existence, begging this man for 1 week off because my dad was taking his final breaths in room 247 of General Hospital. Croft didn't even look up from his scheduling papers when he said, "Find coverage or don't bother coming back. Your personal drama isn't my concern." The words hit me like a freight train, derailing everything I believed about basic human decency. I'd worked every holiday, covered every 6 shifts, stayed late without complaint, and this was my reward. My father, the quiet man who raised me alone after my mother abandoned us when I was 7, was dying, and this creature wearing a cheap tie was more concerned about weekend lunch rush coverage than my heart breaking into a million pieces. Before I tell you what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me if you've ever had someone dismiss the most important moment of your life like it meant absolutely nothing? Because what I discovered about my father and what I did to that manager will change how you think about revenge forever. You need to hear this story until the very end, and also like, subscribe, and click the bell icon because this gets so much more twisted than you could ever imagine. I walked out of that diner without saying another word. Croft's voice followed me through the kitchen, shouting about how I'd never work in this town again, how he'd make sure everyone knew I was unreliable. I drove straight to the hospital where my father lay, connected to machines that beeped with the rhythm of his fading life. Arlo Gardner had been my whole world since I was a child. He worked from home doing what he called number crunching for boring government stuff, always hunched over multiple computer screens in our cramped apartment, wearing the same 3 button-down shirts he'd owned for a decade. Dad died on a Tuesday morning while I held his weathered hand. The nurse said he went peacefully, but peace felt impossible when my entire support system evaporated in that sterile room. I spent the next 6 days arranging a funeral. I couldn't afford fielding calls from his few colleagues who seemed genuinely shocked by his passing, and trying to figure out how someone making $11.05 an hour was supposed to handle burial costs, rent, and basic survival. The funeral was small. A handful of his co-workers showed up, along with Mrs. Patterson from next door, who always complained about our television being too loud. But there were also 3 men in expensive suits who stood at the back of the chapel, never introducing themselves, just watching with the kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. When I approached them after the service, they simply nodded respectfully and left without explanation. Returning to work the following Monday felt like stepping back into a nightmare. I temporarily escaped. The diner looked exactly the same, smelled the same, sounded the same. Croft stood behind the counter, that perpetual sneer painted across his face, like he'd been born wearing it. The other waitresses, Penny and Rue, gave me sympathetic looks but kept their distance. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew better than to cross-scoffed. I tied my apron around my waist and grabbed my order pad, expecting the usual morning rush of construction workers and office people grabbing coffee before their real lives began. But something felt different. The kitchen staff kept glancing toward the front entrance, and Penny kept checking her phone with worried expressions. Then I saw him. A man in a tailored navy suit stood by the host station, scanning the dining room with the focused attention of someone conducting surveillance. He wasn't here for pancakes or coffee. His presence commanded attention in a way that made conversations pause and customers turn in their chairs. When his gaze landed on me, recognition flickered across his features. Elise Gardner. His voice carried authority that made my name sound important for the first time in years. I nodded, suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must look in my polyester uniform with its grease stains and frayed edges. "My name is Director Hayes, with the Treasury Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." The words hit me like lightning. Treasury Financial Crimes Division, government authority, the kind of serious business that had nothing to do with diner waitresses or people like me. Croft materialized beside us with that oily smile he reserved for customers he thought might complain to corporate. "Is there a problem here? Because Elise just lost her father and she's been a bit emotional lately." Director Hayes fixed Croft with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. "Actually, there's no problem at all, Miss Gardner. Could we speak privately?" I untied my apron and followed him outside, leaving Croft standing there with his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. We sat in his government sedan, and Director Hayes opened a briefcase that contained documents with my father's name printed across the top in bold letters. "Your father was one of our most valuable forensic accountants," he began, and I felt my understanding of reality start to crumble. "For 15 years, Arlo conducted covert audits of major corporations suspected of tax evasion. His work was so thorough, so methodical, that we built our entire prosecution strategy around his findings." I stared at the documents, seeing my father's name attached to case files involving millions of dollars. This quiet man who wore the same 3 shirts and ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day, had been living a completely different life than the one I knew. The company you work for, Director Hayes continued, pointing toward the diner, was his final assignment. Hartwell Food Services has been systematically evading federal taxes for 8 years. Your father documented everything: shell companies, offshore accounts, falsified employee records, tip theft, wage manipulation. The evidence he compiled could put the executives in federal prison for decades. Tilted sideways, I'd been serving coffee to criminals who were stealing from their own workers, while my father secretly built the case that would destroy them. But here's our problem, Director Hayes said, his expression growing grave. Your father was paranoid about digital security. He encrypted all his findings and stored them in cryptocurrency wallets with access keys that only he knew. We've been searching his apartment, his computers, everything, and we can't find those keys anywhere. What does that mean? It means 8 years of evidence just disappeared when your father died, unless you studied my face carefully, unless he left you some way to access those files. I thought about Dad's desk at home, still exactly as he'd left it, stacks of notebooks filled with numbers and codes that look like gibberish, USB drives labeled with dates and random letters, a safe hidden behind his bedroom dresser that I'd never opened because I didn't know the combination he might have, I said slowly. Director Hayes leaned forward. Miss Gardner, those files contain evidence of tax evasion totaling $47 million. If we can recover them, your father's work will take down one of the largest corporate fraud schemes we've ever investigated. $47 million. The number felt astronomical, impossible, completely disconnected from my world of dollar tips and day-old pastries. What happens if I find these files? Just as he said simply, and a substantial reward for your cooperation. I returned to work that afternoon, feeling like I was living in someone else's life. Croft watched me with suspicious eyes, probably wondering why government agents were pulling his employees aside for private conversations. I poured coffee and took orders on autopilot while my mind raced through everything I thought I knew about my father. That evening I sat in Dad's chair and really looked at his workspace for the first time. The notebooks weren't random, they followed patterned sequences, mathematical progressions that meant something to someone who understood their logic. The USB drives were labeled with dates that corresponded to specific entries in his handwritten notes. The safe combination took me 3 hours to figure out. Dad always said I was the smartest person he knew, and apparently he'd hidden the answer in plain sight: his birthday, my birthday, and the date my mother left us, arranged in the order they'd shaped our lives together. Inside the safe I found a single envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting. The letter inside contained 24 alphanumeric sequences, each labeled with a company name. Hartwell Food Services was number 17 on the list. The next morning I dressed for work, knowing everything was about to change, but first I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with and how deep this conspiracy went. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored: Croft's expensive watch, despite the diner's supposedly struggling finances, the way he processed cash tips that never made it onto official records, the mysterious late-night meetings he held in the office with men who definitely weren't food suppliers. Penny mentioned that her overtime hours never appeared on her payups. Rue complained about health insurance deductions that never resulted in actual coverage. The kitchen staff worked split shifts to avoid full-time benefits, but somehow the scheduling always guaranteed they'd work just enough hours to be considered part-time. I began documenting everything: shift schedules that violated labor laws, cash register readings that didn't match reported sales, customer counts that seemed impossible given the actual foot traffic, every detail my father would have noticed if he'd been investigating this place. 3 weeks after the funeral I'd accumulated enough evidence to understand the scope of what Dad had been building. Hartwell Food Services wasn't just evading taxes, they were systematically stealing from every employee who worked for them while creating fraudulent records that made the whole operation look legitimate. But I also realized something else: I didn't have to give this evidence to the government immediately. I had other options. Late one night I researched Hartwell's main competitor, a company called Summit Restaurant Group that had been trying to expand into our territory for months. They'd made several attempts to buy out Hartwell's locations, but the deals always fell through due to what the business journals called regulatory complications. I wondered what those complications might be worth to someone who could eliminate them permanently. The next day I called Summit's corporate offices and asked to speak with their acquisitions department. Within an hour I was sitting across from their development director, a sharp woman named Victoria Cross, who listened to my proposition with a kind of focused attention that told me she understood exactly what I was offering. Let me make sure I understand, she said carefully. You have documentation that could force H. Hartwell into federal bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, and you're willing to provide that evidence to us instead of the authorities for the right price? I confirmed. What did you have in mind? $47 million, the exact amount they owe in back taxes. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't laugh or call security. Instead, she asked why that Specific number because it's what justice costs we negotiated for 2 hours. Victoria made calls to lawyers and executives and people whose titles I didn't recognize. By the end of the meeting, we had an agreement Summit would pay me $47 million for exclusive access to my father's evidence, with the understanding that they would handle the legal proceedings in whatever way served their business interests. The contract took a week to finalize. During that time, I continued working at the diner, watching Croft abuse his employees and steal their wages while having no idea that his entire world was about to crumble. I thought about my father every day, wondering if he would approve of what I was planning. He'd spent 15 years building airtight cases for the government, believing in official justice and legal procedures, but official justice hadn't helped him when he was dying alone while his daughter begged for basic human compassion from a man who saw people as disposable. The day the payment cleared in my account, I walked into the diner for my final shift. Croft stood behind the register counting cash drawer receipts with his usual scowl, probably calculating how much he could skim without anyone noticing. I approached him with a single piece of